This episode is sponsored by my online course, Mineral Management Basics. Understand what you own, gain the power to manage your minerals and royalties. Did you first find out that you inherited mineral rights or royalties from a phone call or a letter from a landman or mineral buyer? Do you want to have a better handle on what it is that you own so you aren't caught off guard next time? If you're like most people, you want to learn all you can about being a responsible and informed mineral owner. I'm going to help you cut through all the confusion to not only learn more about your existing mineral rights and royalties, but to also equip you with the tools to find out if you might own other interests that you don't currently know about. In Mineral Management Basics, I'll walk you step by step through the process of finding out exactly what you own and where it is located, with high-quality videos that aren't too long and examples along the way. You'll be able to locate your mineral and royalty interests on a map, perform your own title search, and identify nearby oil and gas activity. Your interests are depending on you to find them. Go to mineralrightspodcast.com and click on courses. Again, that's mineralrightspodcast.com and click on the courses link to learn more.
Are you ready to make the most of your oil and gas mineral rights? Welcome to the Mineral Rights Podcast. Get the knowledge and resources you need to manage your minerals and royalties. Here is your host, Matt Sands.
Hello and welcome to the Mineral Rights Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Sands, and I'm joined by my co-host, Justin Williams, and we're here to help you make the most of your minerals and royalties. And in this episode, we're going to answer your listener questions that have been submitted. And it's May of 2024 when this episode is going to be released, Justin. And we've had some really interesting questions, and we're almost caught up through the end of 2023. So my apologies for those of you who have been waiting for an answer. You know, I promise we'll get you something here soon. So we'll try to do these a little more frequently to make it a little more interactive. And I thought there were some really fun questions this month, Justin.
Yeah, there are some interesting questions here and some good tips, too, that people have submitted on the way that they go about it. And Matt, that's kind of what our first one is here. It is from Tom. And Tom is suggesting, so he said, I found it helpful to list branches of the family tree that mineral owners came down through. For example, my ancestors came in the land run in Oklahoma and owned minerals for almost 100 years, and great-grandparents down to him. Then I've used those names and found minerals that missed probate records. The money in suspense identifies the minerals that missed either getting into probate records or companies couldn't find or didn't do the homework for descendants. And he says he's using familysearch.org to list ancestors, dates, locations, and then kind of goes from there to highlight the branches that the minerals come down through. And Matt, that's a wonderful tip and a great way to kind of build your chain of title that is something that the operators may ask about anyways.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I like the tip of familysearch.org. I use that as well when doing title research for clients. So that's a great tip. And his email was just a little context here. This email was in response to the second email that gets sent out when you sign up for the Mineral Rights Podcast newsletter. So he's a subscriber to my newsletter. This particular email that I send out has tips to find out if you have missing money. And so I go through various steps to follow, step by step on how to find that. And if you want to see that email, get that tip, go to mineralrightspodcast.com. There's a form at the bottom of my homepage. You can sign up to the email newsletter. I send out emails about once a week based on the episodes we have. And then, when you first sign up, there's a series of emails that go through some free information and some helpful tips. So that's a little bit about what he's talking about. And in that email, I mentioned entering your last name and first name as the starting point, and then, going through your ancestors. And he said, well, one suggestion in your step, instead of your last name and first name, I would say enter you or your ancestors' last name and first name. So thanks for that additional clarification, Tom. I think that's a great point. And that's a good way to find out, again, if you have minerals or royalties that might be out there that you don't know about, because it could be that they missed going through probate, like you mentioned. And you want to look at your genealogy and see who your ancestors were. And if they had potentially homesteaded some land and stuff, there's a chance they might have owned minerals. And so you'd want to go back through those different names that are out there and see if anything might pop up. So yeah, great tip there.
Absolutely, man. And our next one here is from Anita. And She says, I'm a mineral owner. The issue is how to get a operator of an Oklahoma stripper well to pay. And she gives some background. She talked to him one time after it had been producing for months. She got a personal looking check for about $2,000, no stub and no 1099. It just says that was a year ago last May. He's in Texas. She sent a certified letter that was returned undeliverable. And Matt, this is something we hear all too often for numerous amounts of reasons.
Yeah, it's not uncommon for wells that are stripper well, and that typically means it makes less than a barrel of oil per day or right around that. So, it's a very low producing well. It's typically something that's an older vertical well, and you're basically in the last legs. And it's to the point of where you have some very small operators that a lot of times the financial assurance requirements are cost prohibitive for them. And that comes on to the point of making a decision. Do I plug and abandon this well at an expense, or do I spend the money to continue to produce? And we were talking before we hit record that, Justin, I know you've experienced this with some wells in like New Mexico and Texas. And I was just mentioning that I have the similar situation I'm dealing with in Colorado. And so, I guess from that standpoint, Justin, you want to answer this first? Kind of what are your tips as to what Anita might think about doing?
You're really just trying to get into contact with the operator, and pursuing that is one of the best ways that you can go about it. You could always work with an attorney, but it's one of those things where you're making an investment on your side for something that might not be a guaranteed return. And Matt, like you said, some of these operators are really struggling to be able to do this. And though you may have a claim, you kind of have to balance what would the cost be to pursue that claim. And one of the things she could do, Matt, is she could definitely take a look at the Oklahoma website and make sure that these wells are still producing. And Matt, she kind of came back and said that she did do that. And as of July 2023, that they did show to be producing. And then also, if it's not producing very much, it's possible that you haven't hit your minimum. And so if you haven't hit the minimum payout, you may not have received a check yet, though that may be coming. Again, reaching out to the operator and kind of finding out what is going on would be step one. If the operator is not responsive, then your options are, you have to kind of explore them a little more.
Yeah, that's a good point. And we have some additional tips in episode 224 where we talk about what to do about late royalty payments. So each state has certain payment thresholds, and that's what you're referring to, Justin. Just for people that are listening, if you're in Oklahoma, for example, if the well has been producing for more than a year and the amount that's being held in suspense exceeds $25, they're obligated to pay you at that point. So there's a bunch of different criteria, but typically it's between $25 and $100 minimum payment. And so what Justin was referring to is if it's, low producing well, you have a small interest in it, it could be that the interest is just in suspense. So in other words, they're just waiting for enough royalties to accrue to meet that minimum payment threshold, at which time they'll cut you a royalty check. And so, and like Justin mentioned, Anita, there was a couple emails that went back and forth in my correspondence with Anita, and she said that it was producing as of July 2023, and she believes it was more than the $100 statutory minimum for Oklahoma. Again, based on the amounts that were reported to the Oklahoma Tax Commission. So, that was the initial check. Obviously, you need to do is just check to see, is this well even still producing? If it's not, then that's the reason that you aren't receiving royalty checks, right? It's plain and simple. You only get paid when they sell oil and gas. Another thing that I've run into is where the well may still be producing, but they may only sell oil once or twice a year. So Justin and I recently covered this in our episode that we showed you how to use the Wyoming Oil and Gas Commission website, episode 240, where the example well that we used actually did not sell any oil in the calendar year of 2023 when we were looking at the data. And so even though it had produced a little bit, it was all just going to the storage tanks there on the well site. And it hadn't reached out enough to where they could bring in a tanker truck to sell it. And usually that's between, say, 150 and like 200 barrels of oil before they call out a truck to draw down the tank and to sell that oil. So you may have that well producing a few barrels each month, and it's just going into the storage tank. So even though it is producing, Anita, this could be another reason in that they're producing, but it hasn't reached that minimum threshold where they brought in a truck to go and offload it and to sell the oil. So yeah, various reasons that it could be. Like Justin said, I would just say next steps, I would recommend definitely hiring an attorney if it makes financial sense. If there's enough on the table there, The other recourse you have would be potentially filing a complaint with the Oklahoma Corporation Commission. And we'll put a link in the show notes where you can go to that complaint form for Oklahoma. So, Anita, hopefully that helps, and hopefully they're more responsive in the future. So, good luck.
Okay, Matt, our next one here is from Ronnie. And this isn't so much a question as him sharing our experience with us, which is really great to hear. So Ronnie says, "Hello, Matt. I'm a mineral owner, and he first met you, it sounds like, at the Colorado Narrow Convention that was held online due to COVID. He goes on to say that when I was 9, my parents leased their property. My mom used the money to pay for college, became a teacher. When I reached college age, my parents sent me and my brothers to the University of Texas. Ronnie became a mechanical engineer and worked in the industry producing oil drilling equipment. When Ronnie married his wife, she inherited royalty property, and he purchased one of his wife's cousin's property, and he now manages about 100 small properties in 35 counties in 4 states. Ronnie is now 79 years old and working on training his son to take over the property. Obviously, Matt, it's a lot to learn, and he's still learning, and he's also using Naro as a way to help share the knowledge with his son. And so, Matt, what a wonderful story. And, this is kind of how it goes. One person typically holds this knowledge, and you have to pass it on to the next generation. And it's easy to not think about it until, maybe it's too late, or maybe you should have started years ago.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think that a lot of people maybe wait till the last minute before they educate the next generation. So kudos to you, Ronnie, for training your son to take over those interests, to manage your family's legacy. And so, like Justin mentioned, and like Ronnie mentioned, NARO is a great resource for this. That's the National Association of Royalty Owners. Like Justin and I have mentioned on the show before, both he and I are involved in various capacities at the state chapter level as well as national board level, and helping to produce content for mineral and royalty owners that help educate them. So in addition to this podcast, which obviously is a great resource for that, NARO is an amazing place because you can also network with other mineral and royalty owners, go to in-person conventions. We have webinars, other things like that on different topics. So, that's a great resource. And Ronnie, your story resonated with me as well. My background was as a mechanical engineer as well. And actually my first job while I was going to college, I had an internship with a company that made oil drilling tools. So basically a similar trajectory, it sounds like, with what you did for your career before you retired. But I just remember that being really fun and learning about how these tools were used in the field when they went to go drill a well. Or actually, what I did was helped design and engineer and test fishing tools, which it's not like fishing for fish. Actually, it's to fish a drill string that breaks off when they're drilling a well. So this can happen when they drill a well. They get stuck and the drill bit won't come out. And if it gets stuck and it's not able to come out of the hole, what the limiting factor is usually the drill pipe. And that drill pipe can separate, basically will break if they pull on it and the drill bit doesn't want to move, pull too hard, it'll break. And so they have to go in with one of these tools to try to grab onto that fish, they call it. That's a broken off piece of drill pipe down in the hole or whatever it is that broke off in there. They try to grab onto it and pull it out so they can continue to drill in that wellbore. If they can't do that, they have to sidetrack the well, and that's additional time and expense. So that's why sometimes your operator may go and try to drill a well and you find out that it was unsuccessful. Well, one of the reasons it could be one of these mechanical issues that they run into. So anyway, just as far as that little bit of a side note on drilling and how it's all done. But again, Ronnie, thanks for writing in. I'm glad all of this has been helpful. Glad that you're a part of NARO. And again, we'll link in the show notes to the NARO website if you want to find out more about that for those of you listening. So thanks again.
All right, man. So our next one here is from Karen. And Karen is asking a question about something we mentioned in one of our podcasts, which we were talking about lithium mining and that there is potential in the Smackover Formation map in Texas for there to be lithium. She goes on to say that her rights are on Burleson, Texas, and wondered if yourself, Matt, or I might know if Burleson is in the Smackover Formation area. And she goes on to say the division order does include water. And so the question really is, Matt, would she be open to the lithium mining? And what can she do to kind of protect her rights there?
Yeah, thanks, Karen, for your email. I'm glad you've been enjoying the podcast. I did a little bit of research before we hit record on this particular area and found a USGS report that dives into the geology of the Smackover Formation in this area. And it looks like Burleson is just west of the area. that the USGS categorized as part of the smackover. But keep in mind that this is based on the data and the knowledge that they have at the time that they publish that report. As new information comes in, they may find that they extend the extents of the productive part of the smackover into parts west near where you have interests. And so, that is a possibility. And if that is the case, it would certainly be worthwhile to try to protect your rights to any valuable substances contained within that producing water. So, like you mentioned, your division order does include water on it. So I think that's probably a good indication that your lease probably has some protective language in there. But, again, be careful when you sign that division order, just as another note, because sometimes operators will try to use the division order to amend the terms of the oil and gas lease. And so you just want to make sure that you're careful in reading the language and that you're understanding how that could affect your rights. And as always, we always recommend, if you have questions or concerns about any language in any document, whether it be a contract like a oil and gas lease, a division order, or if you're looking to buy or sell minerals, having an attorney that is qualified and practice law in the state where your minerals are located is very important. So that's probably the one recommendation there. And then we'll link to this report that I mentioned in the show notes that outlines the extents of that Smackover formation, which I know Justin Lithium has definitely been in the news a lot lately.
It has, Matt. Yeah, and it'll be interesting to see. We had talked maybe in that show or in a previous show about the price of lithium and how it was kind of stalling the development or exploration of bringing that online. So it'll be interesting to see over the next couple of years how that evens out and if they're able to make some important revelations in lithium mining.
Yeah, and we'll link to these in the show notes. Episode 208, which is the rise of lithium and implications for mineral owners. And then the other one was most recently episode 232, which was mineral rights news for February of 2024, where we talked about what Exxon is doing in Arkansas, specifically around mining for lithium through produced water. So,
all right, Matt. So our next one here is from Raegan. And Raegan says he has parents that are getting older, and he's began assisting them with managing their minerals. And he had a question that he was having trouble sorting out. It looks like there's two different sections in where they own minerals, where the lease has expired prior to the completion of the wells. And he kind of lists out the timing here, Matt, of the different wells. And it looks like some of them were started, but maybe not finished by the expiration of the lease. And Matt, this can be something that happens pretty often. And really, it can depend on the state that you're in. And then the oil and gas lease really is going to convey the right to explore and drill to the lease. And you kind of give up the control over how that happens and the timetable that happens on. But do you want to talk, Matt, about the kind of intricacies of whether it might or might not be an issue that the oil and gas lease expired?
Yeah, so that's the gist of Raegan's question. So just diving into his email a little bit deeper. So he gave some dates and some timing. So the first well that he has an interest in that spud on September 30th of 2010, drilling finished on December 9th of 2010, and the oil and gas lease expires, the primary term expired on January 4th of 2011. The well was completed after that point on May 27th of 2011. And according to him, he actually copied a couple of the clauses that relate to this from his lease. He said the primary term, the language was 3 years from the date, as long as thereafter as oil and gas or either of them is produced from said land by the lessee. So basically the primary term is 3 years. That's the important thing. So assume that what he's referring to, he added the 3 years from that effective date of the lease, and that's how he got to the January 4th date. So his question was, okay, so the wells weren't completed and they weren't producing oil and gas before that primary term ended. What is my recourse? Is this an issue? I think is what he's asking. And then the one thing that was important, it really depends on the language of the lease. So that's always the first question as well. You need to look at the lease, and thankfully he copied that over. And in the commencement of operations clause, it says if the lessee shall commence to drill a well or commence reworking operations on an existing well within the term of the lease or any extension thereof, or on any acreage pooled therewith, the lessee shall have the right to drill such well to completion or complete reworking operations with reasonable diligence and dispatch, And if oil and gas, or either of them, be found in paying quantities, this lease shall continue to be enforced with like effect as if such well had been completed within the term of years first mentioned. So deciphering all of that, it basically is saying that if they were to drill the well and can work diligently, in other words, not wait too long and, move forward towards completing that well. And if oil and gas was found and it's in paying quantities, then that well would basically be held by production into the secondary term of the lease. And that's exactly what happened here. So based on the dates that you mentioned, Raegan, for both of those wells, while the oil and gas lease, the primary term technically would have been up before that well began producing, because they actually drilled the well and appears that they were following reasonable diligence and dispatch to get that all completed and to produce. I think you're held by production, and there really is no recourse. Again, the caveat here is this is my opinion. I'm not an attorney. From the information you sent me, if you really want to make sure, the next step would be to contact an attorney that is licensed in the state where your minerals are located to help you decipher your oil and gas lease and compare that with what happened and see if you have a case. Again, I think just provide some context here. Also, it depends on the state that you're in as to the interpretation of case law, as to what the expectations are on the operator when you're in this situation. I think the important thing to keep in mind, though, I think more holistically, is that the oil and gas lease conveys the right to explore and to drill to the lessee. And in doing so, we give up control over exactly when this occurs, right? Or we hope that a well gets drilled and that it produces oil and gas. And thinking of that as the goal, in other words, we want to have quality operators vying for our leases and drilling wells that produce oil and gas so that we receive royalties, because that is the primary source of income from mineral rights. They're not worth anything until you receive revenue from that. And that can be in the form of an oil and gas lease and getting a lease bonus. But the biggest source of that, the largest piece of that pie, is from when a well gets drilled that produces oil and gas and you get paid royalties on that. And in your case, that happened. And so that is a win. And that was the objective, right? So if it were a very long time between when they spud the well and when it started to produce, and maybe you could have an argument that said that they weren't following what they call the prudent operator standard. And basically, there's a lot of implied covenants when you sign an oil and gas lease. In other words, implied expectations in place for the lessee that they do certain things according to what's called the prudent operator standard. And basically, what that prudent operator standard is whatever a reasonable and competent oil and gas operator would do if they acted in good faith. And so in this case, they could potentially argue that they were following the prudent operator standard, working diligently to get that well to where it was capable of production and producing in paying quantities. And the thing to keep in mind is they actually did spud the well before your primary term ended. So that's usually the trigger that says, okay, as long as they spud the well before that primary term ended and they were working diligently towards getting those wells to be able to produce, then that lease is considered to be held by production. So in the timing that you mentioned, where it was roughly, I think in one case, maybe 2 months before it was completed for the second well, and then the first month, it was around 6 months. That to me sounds like a very reasonable time frame. To put it in perspective, when they plan to drill and complete these wells, they're usually looking at it across multiple locations. So they have to plan out these service company crews to show up on site when that well is done drilling and the rig is moved off and it's ready to be completed. And so they'll put a little bit of buffer time in there to make sure that if there's a delay in drilling, that completions crew doesn't sit idle, because that just costs them money each day that they're sitting there, whether they're working or not, they're paying for that. So when they schedule this type of work, it is not uncommon for there to be a slight buffer by a few months before that completions crew is supposed to show up on site. Now, obviously, we, from a mineral owner perspective, we want that as soon as that well is drilled, the next day, and after that rig leaves, we want the completions crew to show up, them to complete the well, and then start producing and paying us royalties right away. But the reality of the situation is they have different contracts in place with these drilling and completions service companies. They have the schedule that they commit to, and they have to schedule it out in advance. And then, there's some fluctuations and things happen, but they try to put a buffer in there, in other words. Now, the other side of things is not uncommon for a well to sit as a drilled and uncompleted well or a DUC for up to like a year. So in some of these basins, you might have a well that gets drilled. In this case, maybe they finished in December of 2010. And if they didn't actually complete that well until, after a year, then you could maybe go in and say, well, that seems like an excessive period of time. Were they actually following the prudent operator standard? And then ultimately you'd want to know what the damages that were. Like, in other words, whatever they did, if it negatively affected you, you would seek some form of compensation. And that would be maybe looking at what the well produced. And if I'd gotten it earlier, I could have had that money sooner and reinvested it and got interest or whatever. In your case, I think it does sound like it's a very reasonable timeline that happened. And I think, I don't know that you would be able to say that they weren't acting in good faith and completing those wells. So yeah, I guess that's my initial take on it. Raegan, again, based on the information you provided, really the gold standard way to really find out for sure if there was an issue, did they trespass or not, depends on the state. Contact an attorney. You could talk about, hey, this is my situation. Do I have a case? Is there any compensation that I'm owed, or what's the situation? What are my options? So that would be the kind of the boilerplate answer would be to contact an attorney. But again, my initial reaction just from looking at the dates, I think it seems very reasonable. And you have 2 producing wells, and you're getting royalties, or at least were as of 2011, and hopefully that well is still producing. So, anything else to add, Justin?
Just that if you're not seeing royalties, Raegan, that might be the question to ask the operator is, why is it that we're not seeing royalties? Because as Matt said, this looks pretty standard, and that lease should be in effect, though maybe it's an issue of the ownership needs to be changed, or who knows, maybe they just can't get into contact with you. But yeah, that's not uncommon, Matt. And we've talked a lot this year about drilled uncompleted wells and how that's kind of become a strategy for inventory for the operators.
Yeah, that's a good point there. They use it as a way to turn on those wells quickly to react to commodity prices. So that's a drilled and uncompleted well situation is very common. And, again, it's because they have certain capital budget constraints. Maybe they have a little bit of money to spend before the end of the year. So they go and drill some additional wells, and then they may sit until there's room in the completion schedule at the end of the next year. And so that ends up getting drawn out. Maybe it's because of commodity prices that they don't accelerate that. If the price of gas is low, for example, companies are still drilling some wells, but they're not completing them now because the price of gas is so low. And so what they're doing is building an inventory of those DUCs. And then when gas prices recover, they can go in and complete those wells fairly quickly, bring them online, and they take advantage of those better commodity prices. So that's a strategy that companies will use as well. So
some interesting questions this month, Matt.
Yeah, interesting questions. Thanks again for everybody that wrote in. If you have a question you'd like us to answer, send it to feedback@mineralrightspodcast.com, and we will do our best to get you an email response, and then we'll answer it on the air. And thanks again for listening. Thanks, Justin.
Thanks, Matt.
Thanks so much for listening to the Mineral Rights Podcast with your host, Matt Sands. Don't forget to subscribe and share at mineralrightspodcast.com. The Mineral Rights Podcast should not be construed as investment, legal, or tax advice. All information is believed to be from reliable sources. However, we make no representation as to its completeness or accuracy.